Okay, welcome back. So I'm starting again this recording, and this is the course in bioethical issues at the end of human life within the Master of Science of Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning as always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated. You shall renew the face of the earth. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, I was giving some hints here before the previous recording failed. So I'm picking up where I left off there. Some little technical hints for composing emails, because many times, or not many times, but sometimes I get an email from someone, can be a student or anybody else, and there should be an attachment and there's no attachment, and because they fail to attach. All right, so it's very common to make that mistake. So here's a little hint that I'm using now as a hard rule whenever I compose an email. I was saying that what I do is I open a First, I open a, okay, so here's my inbox, right? First, I open a new email. And then before I write anything else, I do the attachments. I attach whatever I'm going to attach, okay? Attach, there's nothing there on the desktop. Anyway, so do the attachment first, my suggestion, do the attachment first. Then secondly, compose the text, whatever you're writing there. And then next, just work your way up. In other words, the text, then the title of the email, and then finally to whom it's going. And I usually copy myself, especially if it's an official email, like, for example, correspondence with students or other professors, etc. Usually copy myself. It's just a record that appears on my inbox, right? I also make little folders on the side. On the left-hand side, as you can see on this column here, you can make folders if you want to save some emails that are significant. For example, this is the 7th cohort of the bioethics program. So this folder here, everything that I get from you, I pull in here. For example, your summaries and all that, I dump it on this little folder. Okay, just drag it. You can click and drag in there. So those are just little hints for emails. But the most important thing about this little hint is to attach first and then do everything else. All right. Next is with regards to synaptic pruning. This is a little more in-depth, more important, of greater consequence. And this is my suggestion to you again. It took me a long time to discover this, frankly. But once I discovered it, I thought it was a great key to success in life. And I can tell you, in all honesty, that this has made me very happy, okay? Which is, after we talked about synaptic pruning, we talked about synaptic pruning, right?
Yes.
Okay, and what's the average age of maturity of brain maturity or brain full development for the human? Think of the driver's license insurance or driver's insurance. You forgot already? 25 is when the rate goes down, right? So on synaptic, where did that number come from? Did the insurance company just pull it out of the sky and brought it into Earth from outer space? Why 25? Yeah, statistically, it's based on stat, which is, by the way, a very robust stat. What I mean by a robust stat? The sample population is very significant, is very representative of the population. Is the insurance company going to test the entire population of the US? 230 million people? No, they do a sample, right? But what's the sample? Sample is very robust. What the insurance agencies have access to what kind of data? What are they looking for? They're looking to minimize risks, right? So they can maximize profits. We're all paying insurance. And unless we use the insurance, then the insurance walks away with money. When we use the insurance loses, right? And therefore, the insurance company is trying to maximize profit by minimizing accidents or risk. And so at 20, what data, there are two bits of data. In other words, two numbers that are extremely symbolic and extremely important for the car insurance industry. I have no clue. In other words, I have less than zero experience about car insurance from the insurance side, just as a customer from using the insurance. You know, I've had to use my insurance several times, but I don't know anything about the industry, but this is my intuition. Two numbers that are extremely important for the car insurance industry itself to maximize their profits. They cannot be illegal, right? They cannot just arbitrarily raise the insurance of people if they have a lot of accidents or something like that, but they have to use some data that is probabilistic. So they're basing themselves on a probabilistic model. On average, people will have fewer accidents before or after 25. That's a leading question. On average, the American people who are driving, who have a driver's license, who are getting insurance, they're more likely to have an accident before or after 25 years of age. Before, right? They're more likely. And then how can they prove that? The insurance industry. They go into public records, yeah, but which data? Two numbers. So accidents are public record. They're recorded by the county, by the state, whoever, you know, it's public record. If I have an accident, you can go online and find out when Alfred Chaffee had an accident. Okay, so, and what is also public record that is related to that accident? It's on our driver's license. It's our date of birth. Our date of birth. So the insurance company can figure out my age and my age when I had the accident. You see? So they can figure out my age when I had the accident. And then they can also figure out if I was at fault or not, right? So our age at the time of the accident and if we were at fault or not. And that's extremely important. That's very significant for the insurance company because now they can look at, okay, they can say before 25 years of age, you know, people have more accidents, or there are more accidents in the US than after 25. On average, they're actually using the upper limit of the range of when the brain finally matures organically, meaning that all the synapses are finally connected. The vast majority of synapses are already made for the brain. And then it stays that way until the end of our lives. All right, it could be 20, 30, 40, 50, 80 years later. If we die at 100 years of age, my aunt in Italy, my father's sister, just she turned 100 years old in January. So we can live a long time. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the synaptic pruning occurs to mature the brain, right? And that's when, on average, we can make more mature decisions. And it's between 20 to 25 years of age. That's the range. So what's the average? What's the midpoint? What's the mean? What's the mean between 20 and 25?
23.
About 22.5, 22 and a half years old. So on average, 22 and a half years old is when most humans mature their brain, with a 2.5 year on either side of tails, right? So it's a normal distribution, bell-shaped curve, 2.5 years either side of the bell when it goes practically down to almost zero, not zero, but it's asymptotic. All right, so we can say that on average, anyone who is above from 23 years old forward should have a mature brain. Now, you and I know some adults who are not there yet. And I'm hoping, I don't know if you've ever met someone who is less than 25 years old, less than 20 years old, who is also very mature. I know a few people, not very many, but I know some. I know some 18-year-olds who are more mature than some 40 or 50-year-olds that I know. But that's the exception, okay? The norm is the majority statistic. So this is a little saying that I ran into a few years ago, I would say maybe about 20, 30 years ago. It made a lot of sense to me, which is achieving maturity at the psychological and even at the spiritual level. So this takes it from the physical, the organic level of the brain, to the psychological, which is the mind, the thought process, and even to the spiritual level, which is the soul or the conscience or the spirit, all integrated into one person, each one of us, in the unitary vision of the human person, which is a Western vision of the human person, is unitary. All right? So from self-centered and other motivated to self-motivated and other-centered. Think of a child, for example. Children, kids, what do they want? Well, they want everything. They're just grabbing and taking, and typically everything goes into the mouth. That's called the oral stage for babies and little kids, right? That's why toys have to be safe for eating and chewing, because everything goes into the mouth. All right, so, and the kid, to get the kid to do the homework, they have to be either rewarded or punished. So that's other motivated. It's either self-centered, it's about themselves. That's normal because the brain is not mature yet. So it's kind of normal. The brain is still growing. So self-centered and other motivated, external motivations, right? Punishment or reward. At some point, hopefully, we make the transition to being self-motivated so that we don't need punishment or reward. It's out of principle. It's out of principle. I am going to do my homework out of conviction because I know it's good for me, beyond the fact that I may get 100 or a 0 if I do it or not. It's because I'm learning. Who cares about the grade? I couldn't care less about the grade. I'm interested in the learning, right? And that's why I'm paying money. I'm not paying money to get a grade. I'm paying money to learn something so that I can do something with my learning and apply it into a good job or a good family life and whatever I'm going to do with the knowledge. I'm informing my conscience, especially in bioethics. It's very much an academic degree, because bioethics is not a professional degree that you can go out the door the next day and get an immediate job with it, like you could with some kind of technical thing, like a lawyer or a medical doctor or a nurse or an MBA. No, those are called professional degrees, right? Just like learning mechanics or electronics or how to pilot a plane. Those are professional degrees. But bioethics is an academic degree, which is knowledge that then may or may not be applied at a particular situation. Sooner or later, we're going to apply some knowledge, hopefully, of these teachings, because we're all getting older. Our parents and grandparents are getting older also, and in the end of life issues, sooner or later, something's going to come up. If someone's going to be intubated, a dear person of us went to extubate and so forth. So these issues, believe me, will become relevant to all of us sooner or later, including our very self. Okay. So this shift from self-centered and other motivated to self-motivated and other-centered. In other words, it's no longer myself. I'm living for others. And the more I do that, the happier I'm going to be. It sounds kind of counterintuitive because everyone's seeking their own happiness. Well, what they're seeking actually is their own pleasure. And they have confused happiness with pleasure. Did we talk about the ice cream? Did we talk about the ice cream? That's a real question. Did we talk about the ice cream? No, we didn't talk about the ice cream? All right. I'm not sure which ice cream I like most, either coconut or dulce de leche. I don't know if you've ever had dulce de leche, but it's very tasty. Both are extremely caloric, very sugary. I love them both, and I have a difficulty deciding which I like the most. But anyway, let's say it's coconut, and I'm having a double scoop of coconut with the sugar cone and all that. Love it, enjoy it. I'm at the beach, enjoying that coconut ice cream. All right. And I try to prolong it as long as possible. It takes me half an hour, but sooner or later it's melting, so I got to eat it. So let's say it took me half an hour to eat that delicious ice cream. Eventually, I'm going to brush my teeth. And when I brush my teeth, the taste of that ice cream is gone. So it caused me a lot of pleasure while I was eating it. But once the taste is gone, the pleasure is gone. So there was really no true happiness. There was pleasure in eating that ice cream. But happiness is very different. Happiness is, well, in the case of a priest, for example, I'll tell you what happiness is getting a call at 2 o'clock in the morning to go anoint someone at the hospital, give them the anointing of the sick, which is a very special sacrament reserved for those who are ill and maybe dying. And so give them the anointing of the sick, which also involves a forgiveness of sins, even if the person is unconscious. I get to the hospital, it's in the middle of the night, there's some family members there, everybody's crying because their grandmother is unconscious and is dying, but has not died yet. We pray together, I give them the anointing of this, I give the grandma the anointing of the sick, and then I go back eventually to sleep. The following morning, I get a call from the family with a profuse, they cannot thank me enough because maybe half an hour after I anointed the grandmother, she died. But that family, who's a Catholic family and believers, know that she died in the grace of God with all her sins forgiven. So it's only one way she could go, which is to heaven. Okay, and if I had not gotten up at 2 o'clock in the morning to do that, that little old lady would have died possibly without the anointing of the sick. So that is happiness. And I can tell you, I can remember that event 30 years later. And that it was a pain in the neck to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was raining, thundering, and lightning. And I got there, you know, but that has brought me happiness for 30 years, just thinking about the event. Okay. Very different, pleasure and happiness. Unfortunately, a number of people in our society, I'm sure we can all come up with some names, have confused pleasure with happiness. Okay, so, but if we get into this, self-motivated and other-centered, I've been living it now for some years, and it has brought me tremendous happiness. So I share it with you. Of course, keep in mind that this is a gradual process, okay? It doesn't necessarily happen overnight, even though we do have moments of insights and we have moments of conversions and so forth. But generally, it's a gradual process. We become more and more aware of this. And the more we practice this, the more we practice this, the more we realize that it makes a lot of sense. So I share that with you, especially since we're talking about end-of-life issues, which sooner or later will become very relevant, very personal to us and to our loved ones. Let's continue then. The first lecture was on vital organs and the states of unconsciousness. So just to keep in mind that we have many organs in the body and many of them are important, but not all are vital. However, by definition, a vital organ is keeping the body alive. So we all need one of those dozen, it's about a dozen vital organs, right? between the head and the trunk of our bodies. So we only need one of those to start failing irreversibly for the death process to begin. And again, from two extremes, it could be very sudden, like a heart attack, which would only take a minute or two, and the person, massive heart attack with no CPR, the person is dead. The person, my father was alive 1 minute, and the next minute he was dead at a hotel room in Costa Rica when he turned 65 years of age, his last business trip. They found him the next morning because he didn't show up for a meeting. He was very punctual. And then my mother and I got the call from the hotel manager a little while later when they found him dead in the room. So that's very sudden, a blink. That's one extreme. The other extreme is to go into renal failure or something like that, or liver failure, which can be long-term. Another friend of mine just got diagnosed with breast cancer. And no symptoms, nothing, no pain, no nothing. All of a sudden, the mammogram, there was the imaging, and then biopsy, and now that's a life changer, right? So that's subtle. And if she does nothing about the breast cancer, then that cancer will kill her because it will metastasize. It typically goes into the lymph nodes, under the arms, and then to the rest of the body. And it may take years. It may take 2, 3, 5 years. Right now, like I say, she has no pain. She has no discomfort. She has nothing. In fact, she's going on a trip right now. But unless she takes care of that cancer, the death process has begun. And the therapy may or may not work with all the things that she has going forward, pretty drastic, including surgery. All right, so we have to be aware of those things because we're looking at end-of-life issues, okay? Now, as I say this, if vital organs begin failing irreversibly, the death process has begun, it has to be rather close, rather immediate, okay? We cannot get sarcastic and say, well, Professor, when I was born, I began to die because, you know, sooner or later, some vital organ in my body is going to fail, sooner or later. And it may be decades from the time I was born, but I'm dying. From the time I was born, I'm dying. Yes, but it's not a specific vital organ that is failing irreversibly when we're born. In fact, we can take it further back. Why when we're born? What's so significant about being born? Why now 9 months later, we can say, from the time that I'm a zygote, I have begun to die. Yes, of course, because we have a limited time on Earth, and sooner or later that clock will stop for us, right? Stop ticking. But there's no vital organ that is failing irreversibly, normally, when we were created at the time of our fertilization, all right? When we were a zygote, there's no vital organ. In fact, we didn't have vital organs back then, and there was a single cell that was pluripotent. So think a little bit. All these courses, they take thinking. So reflect a little bit on the statement. When a vital organ begins to fail irreversibly, all right, that means that up until that point, that vital organ has been working healthily, functioning. So when the vital organ begins failing irreversibly, we can say that the death process has begun, okay? That has implications with regards to then the ethical decisions, the bioethical decisions of when to start treatment, when to continue treatment, when to stop treatment. And it has to do with the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of life support. All right, so going forward now, oh yes, on the issue of the states of unconsciousness, the one that is most important to us or most relevant with regards to end-of-life issues, which one do you think it is? With regards to bioethical decisions at the end of human life, the different states of unconsciousness that we saw last time, Which one is most relevant? Let's review them quickly. We talked about what? What's the first one that we saw? Just the Glasgow scale applies to what? Coma. So that's one, right? Coma. A person is, we're walking down the sidewalk, we see a person stretched out on the sidewalk. Is a person drunk? Is a person unconscious? Is a person dead? We have no clue, right? And so, or how about we're at home and we wake up in the morning and we find our spouse on the floor, like Terry Schiavo with Michael, her husband. So these are bioethical issues, right? Coma was one, then fainting, syncope, just a light fainting, or ALS actually is the reverse. The person is fully conscious but cannot move, right? Or locked-in syndrome. And another one was anoxia or hypoxia to the brain. Another one was PVS. What's PVS? Persistent vegetative state. PVS, persistent. In other words, the person is what they call a vegetable. The person is unconscious in bed, could be for years if they have a trach, if the tube is going through the trachea, right? So that person can be maintained indefinitely. If they're fed and with a vent, are we going to keep that person in bed indefinitely? Yes or no? We don't know. We have to go case by case. We have to go case by case. All right. But you see, now it becomes more relevant. So PVS is very relevant with regards to end-of-life issues. And also the ALS, the aminolateral sclerosis, or more broadly, locked-in syndrome, where the person is fully conscious, but they cannot move any longer, all right? Eventually, the organs also begin to shut down internally, but it can take a long time. It could take years. So those are relevant bioethical decisions at the end of life. Let's move forward and let's look at the determination of death, because this has clinical implications, this has legal implications, this has social implications. It also has fiscal implications. What kind of fiscal implication does the determination of death have?
Keeping somebody alive.
Well, keeping someone alive, but if the person is dying, we can try to keep him alive. That has to do with ordinary or extraordinary means, but the person is now dead. What kind of fiscal implications does it have? Well, immediately for the family, this person has to be buried, and that's going to cost some money because that's a funeral home, and hopefully they'll be buried in a cemetery, which also is going to cost money. And now we're talking anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000. Who's going to pay for that? Because the dead person's not going to pay for it directly, right? So inheritance is another one. So the determination of death has a lot of implications. Okay, clinically, for example, if the person is an organ donor, we're not going to extract vital organs from a living person because that's going to kill the person, with the exception of the kidneys that we'll talk about. It's a organ that can be donated while living, one. But basically it has clinical implications. It has legal implications. Is the person legally dead or not? Person have to be declared legally dead. So we're going to look at that determination of death. And we're also going to review again ordinary, extraordinary means, because this is the bioethical distinction here. Ordinary means, as you know, obligate. Extraordinary means do not obligate. How to distinguish between the two? Again, we have to go patient by patient. We have to go person by person. So getting more into the lecture of today, we're going to look at the Uniform Determination of Death Act, acronym UDA, which is an act of Congress. In other words, this is a law that was instituted by Congress in the 80s to establish the determination of death across all states, all 50 states of the US. Also, we're going to look at dying within the context of faith. In other words, put this in a spiritual context. if the person is dying. There's no more cure. Care kicks in. We'll get to it. Review again the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of life support, because this is the crux of the bioethical distinction. Also, we're going to review again the distinction between assisting and substituting vital organs. I want you to be clear on that. The three examples that I gave before. And finally, the crucial question is between killing or allowing to die, because we may not kill the innocent, but we may allow people to die. In fact, we have to allow people to die. All right, because not allowing people to die is actually cruel, it's not ethical. But killing people directly is not ethical. So this distinction is a vital distinction. Let's go forward. It turns out that before the 1980s, in the United States, there was no uniform determination of death. What does that mean? That means that we could be dead in Florida and alive in Mississippi because there was no uniform determination of death. It was up to each state, it was up to each county, it was up to each hospital. Pretty much each state of the 50 states determined what were the reasons for declaring a person dead. All right. For example, did the heart stop, or did the person stop breathing? You know, is the patient breathing anymore? Maybe that was, I'm just saying hypothetically, maybe the determination of death for the state of Florida was no heartbeat. But in Georgia, maybe the determination of death was no breathing, no respiration. So it was not uniform, is what I'm trying to say. And this was throughout the whole 50 states. So that is confusing, right? That's a problem. Because death should be a uniform declaration throughout the whole 50 states. We can think of another example in traffic laws. You know that the interstate system, right? The interstate highways, as the word says, goes from state to state. So for example, I-95, which is just a few blocks away from us. It's I-95 is how many blocks away, more or less? Can anyone figure that? I-95. Yeah.
Right.
We're on 37th Avenue or 32nd Avenue, whichever, we're in the 30s, right?
Yeah.
And I-95 cuts north-south around more or less around 10th Avenue of the city of Miami. So we're about 20 blocks away from I-95, more or less. You get on the expressway, on the Palmetto, you head east and you get to the Golden Gate interchange in about 20 blocks, more or less, right? Okay, so I-95, where does it start and where does it end? Well, it depends if I'm going north or south, right? Since we're in Miami, let's say we're going north. So I-95 starts in Miami, right? Does anybody know where it actually starts? Let's say we go south on I-95 from here, from the northwest. Do you know where it actually ends? Any of you ever been to Key Biscayne? How about Brickell? That area, nice, right? Yeah, it's nice. Lots of restaurants, lots of nice places. Key Biscayne, it's an island, has a bridge, it's fun. Do some sailing there, etc. Anyway, so that's where it starts. I-95 starts there near the entrance of Key Biscayne. That's actually where it starts. If we're going north. Where does it end? How about the border with Canada?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it covers the whole eastern United States. It goes through, I don't know how many, maybe a dozen states. All right, that's why it's called an interstate. And that's what it's I. The I for 95 means that it's an interstate. And what does the 95 mean? Is there an I-97? or an I-99? If there were an I-97 or an I-99, where would it be? It would be east. It would be on the water. It would be on the Gulf Stream. So this is the last interstate, right? That is vertical in the U.S. that is eastmost. So where do they count? Where's I-1? In California. And I don't know for sure, but you would expect I-1 to go from where to where? From the border of Mexico to the border of Canada, the easternmost before you fall into the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean. That's I-1. And in fact, there is an I-1 out there, all right? And then we start counting, so we can say how many interstate roads are there approximately from 95, but it's I-1, I-3, I-7, I-11. I think there's some numbers that are skipped. But what's interesting about I-1, I-7, I-27, I think I-27 goes through Colorado because my brother and sister-in-law used to live there. I think we've taken it sometimes. There's an I-57, I think it is, that goes through Indiana that I may have used when I was studying at Purdue. How about I-75? That's in Florida.
I-10.
Yeah, but wait, now you changed, you've gone from what numbers to what numbers? 10, yeah, but 10. So how about, okay, natural numbers can be grouped into two categories. Natural numbers, or all the positive numbers, right? 0 to infinite. Whole numbers, two big categories. Either or. What's the difference between 10 and 11? Or 95 and 96? 92. Even odd, exactly, even odd, right? So interstates that are vertical are odd numbers. I-10 goes from where to where? Georgia, California. And it's the lowest one. So that's 10. Then 12, 14, 16, somewhere, you know. So it's a grid. It's a grid. It meanders around, because, life is not straight path. But in general, the interstate road system of the US, vertical is odd numbers. Horizontal is even numbers. So, for example, I-75 also starts in Miami, right? Over there on the Palmetto, not too far from here. And first it goes where? Let's say we get on I-75. Where do we go? First, we head west to where?
Naples.
To Naples. So we go in horizontal, but then turns north and goes vertical. It keeps going through the US. And maybe it ends up in the Great Lakes somewhere up there, Canada, 75. So you see, and they're not from 95 to 75, or how many numbers? 20. Are there 20 interstates in between I-95 and I-75? Are there 20 interstates? No, there's not even 10 of them. There would only be 10 because it's the odd numbers. So it's not it's not continuous, all right? There's skips. So that means that there's not 95 interstates between California and the West Coast and the East Coast. But what I wanted to point out is that the interstate system goes through states. Now, how about if in Florida, let's stick with I-95. So we get on Key Biscayne, we're going north on I-95. And it's two ways, right? Maybe 3, 4, 5 lanes on each side, doesn't matter, but it's a two-way street, right? It's a two-way street. You have traffic going north and you have traffic going south on different sides of the road. So north is on what side? If we're going north, going north is on what side of the road, left or right?
Right.
Yeah, going north.
Right.
It's on the right. And coming south is it's the opposite road, right? So opposite traffic. All right. So we get on I-95 there by Key Biscayne. We're heading north. We're going to Canada. We cross the border to Georgia. Let's say in Georgia, the traffic laws are backwards because they have a lot of British influence. I'm just making it up. They're all Brits there. So it means that the traffic going north is on the left lane. And the traffic coming south is on the right side. What's going to happen in the border between Georgia, Florida, and Georgia on 95? We're going to have head-on collisions, massive, at 60, 70, and 80 miles an hour because no one respects the traffic laws. So you see, there is a important need for having uniformity of laws throughout the states for many reasons. One of them is traffic laws. That's an obvious one. Yes. Okay, so there is a commission. There's a commission, there's a conference, there's a commission of people like you and I who belong to this commission, and they are in charge of drawing up uniform state laws so that it applies to all 50 states. But they are state laws. In other words, in the state of Florida on I-95, maybe the speed limit on I-95 is 60 miles an hour. But in Georgia, maybe it's 70 miles an hour. That's a state law. But these commissioners, these people, these men and women, seek uniformity at the national level for these laws. So if the speed limit in Florida is 60 miles an hour, they're going to try to convince the legislators of Georgia not to put the speed limit at 30 miles an hour, okay, to keep it at 60. All right, if you go to 70, then keep it at 70. But these people are in charge of designing and crafting and proposing uniformity of laws to the state legislators so that there will be uniformity across all 50 states. You understand the significance of this, okay? And it has all kinds of social implications, it has legal implications, and et cetera, et cetera. So one of the issues was to draw up a uniform determination of death so that it would apply to all 50 states, but respecting the fact that we are a United States, that all 50 states had to buy into it. In other words, all 50 legislations had to agree to have this uniform determination of death. All right? And that in fact happened in 1981, and it was approved by Congress by an act. You understand that an act of Congress is when Congress legislates, it's called an act. And then it goes to the president. If the president signs it or not, it becomes law or not. Okay? The same with state legislations. This legislator in Tallahassee, this legislation, which is a big tall building in front of the Tallahassee courthouse at the state level, these are state legislators, right? Many states follow the federal system, which is 2 branches of legislation. What are the 2 branches of legislation? Senate, what is the question again? What are the 2 branches of legislation of the legislative? Yeah, Senate and Congress. Well, Senate, that's Congress. Senate and House of Representatives. In other words, senators and representatives. Many states follow that same structure at the state level. So we have state senators and we have state representatives. Not all states. Some of the older states have a different system, a little different system, like in Massachusetts and so forth. But most states follow that. But they do have a legislature, okay? And they also have a judicial system, including a state Supreme Court. So there's a state Supreme Court, there's a federal Supreme Court, right? And then there is the enforcement, the executive branch. The executive branch of government is in charge of what? Enacting the law, putting the law into place, enforcing the law. So at the federal level, what is the executive branch of government? The president, the White House. And then all that is under the White House, including the federal police, including the armed forces, that's all under the White House. So that's the executive branch, right? Okay. At the state level, who is the president at the state level? The governor. So under the governor is all the state police, state patrol, and all that, and police departments, all that is under the governor's office. Okay, that's the executive branch. That's the branch that seeks to enforce the law that was legislated. And what does the judicial branch do? Like a state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, they judge. They judge whether the law is legal or not, whether the law is according to the Constitution or not. And there is a Supreme Constitution, there is a Constitution of the United States, and also each state also has their own constitution, and they cannot contradict each other. And which one takes precedence? Each state has, we have a state constitution, we have a Florida state constitution, you can get online and read it. We have a Florida state constitution, okay? Which one takes precedence? The Supreme Court, right? Because that's overall, exactly. So if there's a contradiction in the state constitution, that has to be changed. The state constitution can be more restrictive than the US Constitution, but cannot be more liberal, cannot be more lax. All right, going forward. So this was quite a big to do, because how do you get uniformity about the declaration of death? Well, there are two bodies, two recognized official bodies in the United States that can help a lot to determine death. Clinically and legally, because they have to be the same, right? If we declare a person clinically dead, they're also legally dead. They better match up, okay? And which of those two bodies do you think that can be very informative, can give a lot of input on when to declare a person dead, a patient dead or a person dead? How about the medical profession? And what is the most recognized medical agency or group in the United States? AMA, American Medical Association. It's a group. Doctors don't have to belong, but it's very prestigious. And if they don't belong, then there are a lot of negative consequences for the practice of medicine. Okay, so the American Medical Association, AMA, has a lot of power, including political power, including they have a lobby group in Washington, D.C. for sure. They have a lobby group in each state legislature and so forth, promoting for their lobbying for their stuff. Has a lot to do with insurance companies and regulation and coding. Each procedure has to be coded with a number for insurance purposes, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and how about the other one? That's on the medical side. How about on the legal side? We are the commissioners seeking to make the declaration of death uniform across the 50 states. We're going to consult the AMA. Which other group of society are we going to, group of professionals are we going to consult?
American Bar Association.
The ABA, the American Bar Association. Now that one is by state. So a lawyer, to be able to practice law, has to be barred, has to be licensed where? At the federal level? No, at the state level. So the ABA is at the level of each state. So for a lawyer to practice law, they have to be licensed, they have to pass the bar in whatever state they're going to practice. Okay, so a lawyer may be licensed in Florida and not in Georgia. If they have not passed they passed the Florida bar, but not the Georgia bar. Different from a medical doctor. A doctor is a doctor across the US. Okay, they may or may not have privilege at a particular hospital, but they're doctors across the US. So anyway, there it is. These two big groups, professionals, are the ones that were consulted by the commissioners. And there was a third group that was also consulted, which is the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research. It's a mouthful, and basically it's the Bioethics Commission of the President. So the President's Bioethical Commission. Each president puts together this commission. Okay, each president puts together, yeah, it's a mouthful. Each president in their term puts together this commission because that has political implication, it has ideological implications, it has philosophical and theological implications. So it depends on which party is in the White House. This commission in general, this is a general statement, is going to be more liberal or more conservative, depending if the Democrats are in the White House or the Republicans are in the White House. All right. And sometimes some presidents keep some members from the previous administration, which were from the different party, and sometimes they don't. So it's up to each president. But whatever commission was in place at that time, when this happened in 81, which I don't know if the White House was Democrat or Republican, you can look it up, 81, which one it was. But that's the commission that was consulted because they were the official people assigned by the president in office at that time. Okay, so these three groups were consultative to the commissioners, and the commissioners came up finally with a very succinct statement. It sounds simple, but it crunched it down to here. Two definitions for death. Two ways of determining death. This is very informative because traditionally there's only been one way to determine death. We have to look at symptoms, right? Is a person dead or alive? What do we look at? We're looking for evidence. We're looking for physiological evidence because we're talking about matter. The matter is the organism in front of me, this corpse or this person. Is this a person or is this a corpse? You know, so traditionally or classically or normally, what is the standard definition of death or determination of death? Two vital signs that can be observed, can be measured, can be felt, can be heard, can felt literally on the skin. Rigor mortis is later, it's after death, is when the corpse becomes rigid, hard, and it's difficult to move around or to bend.
No heartbeat.
No heartbeat, and what goes with it?
No air.
No respiration, all right? So which are the vital organs that are, there are three vital organs involved in that?
The lungs, the heart.
And the lungs, because how many lungs we have? We have 5 lobes, you know, one lung has 3 lobes, the other lung has 2 lobes, but 2 lungs and 1 heart. So when those guys stop, that's the classical definition of death, all right? And I say 2 lungs because, again, I've mentioned that Pope Francis only has 1 lung and he's not dead yet. So a person can live with 1 lung, all right? All right. So you see my point, classical, and how do we can hear it? How can we hear that?
Heart.
Yeah, exactly. We put our ear next to the chest, right up to the chest of the person who seems to be dead. and we may hear or not hear a heartbeat. I don't know if you've ever done that to a person, but go up to a person's chest and hear the heartbeat. You can hear the heartbeat literally. So that's a physical symptom, all right, that can be measured. And how can we feel a breath?
The rise and fall of the chest.
Sorry?
Or I was gonna say the rise and fall of the chest from the air.
Well, we can see, we observe, it could be very, very shallow breathing, right? Very shallow breathing. We may not see, the senses are engaged. We may not see the chest rise and fall because the person is in shallow breathing, very shallow. Maybe it's just diaphragmatic breathing and not, the ribs are not moving. But, so we may or may not see, we cannot see the heart beating. We may or may not see the chest rising and falling. That's two senses already. What other sense can we use for detecting breathing? Yeah, good. Pulse. Well, pulse, but is that breathing? Pulse is not breathing. Pulse is heartbeat. All right, so we have a second confirmation on the heartbeat, sound and touch.
Like blue lips, like skin.
Yeah, we can see exactly. It's called, what is that called? Blue lips, right? The pale skin and so forth. We can see that, right? How about the back of our hands? Where would we put the back of our hands to detect breathing or not? Right up to the nostril. You can do that. Just put the back of your hand right up to your nostril. Very slightly, but you can feel. You can feel actually the hairs on the back of the hand moving very slightly. So that's another one that can be used. A little more sophisticated would be what? Right up to the nostrils. If we happen to have a mirror in our pocket, a little bit, you'll see a little bit of fog, a little bit of fog, okay, which is actually water vapor. So that's why we should always have a pocket in our little mirror in our pockets. Anyway, that's another one. It's a little more sophisticated, but it can be seen. So really 4 of the 5 senses we can get involved. Taste, I don't know how we can taste death. We cannot taste the heartbeat, we cannot taste the lungs directly. But the other 4 senses we can get engaged in trying to determine that. So anyway, that's the first one. Irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. Notice that it's put in functional terms. Functional terms. You know how I said to students, think functionally. Because normally, what do we see? What do we hear? Well, what do we see? We see structures. We don't see functions. You know, we see structures. But this definition is put in functional terms. Respiratory or circulatory, right? Function. The structures, what are the structures of circulatory? What are the structures of circulatory?
The veins and arteries.
And how about the pump? Heart, cardiac muscle, right? What are the functions of respiratory? The lungs, right? Okay, so that's the classical one that's been around for millennia. Now, this is an or. It's not an and, but it's an or. Very important, this or, especially for what? This or is very important for, since it can be done today, and it's been proven more and more successful over the years, organ transplants, vital organ transplants. I think I've told you, a friend of mine was waiting for a heart for 10 years. That heart had to be cadaveric, right? Because we're not going to take out the heart for a living person to put it into another person, kill one person in process of healing another one. So he waited 10 years for a heart to show up. And a heart showed up, and there he is. It's been about 5 years now, and he's doing great, thanks be to God. A lot of medication, a lot of care, and etc. Immune system, but he's doing fine. Okay, so irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. Right? So you see my point about the brain stem? Thanks be to God that the brain stem was included. And it's actually is emphasized 3 times. We'll get to the 3 times of the stem emphasized. But you see, either one. And this was passed finally by the states, by each one of the 50 states, all the way up to 1981. So now, for over 40 years, we have in the United States a uniform determination of death. And what is that uniform determination of death? Either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. So it's there in black and white, as you can see here. And this applies for all states, all 50 states, right? And so now doctors and lawyers and everybody else in society has to go by this, because this is a uniform state law. Sweet. All right. Okay. Now let's look at it. What does it mean functionally? The first one is called the standard criterion, also known as the cardiopulmonary criterion, for obvious reasons. Why is it obvious? Cardiopulmonary. Those are the 2 vital organs that are involved structurally. All right. And then no heartbeat and no breathing. This is the function. No heartbeat, no breathing. That's the standard or classical or normal definition of death. Has been around, like I say, for millennia. This one, neurological criterion, is relatively new. Relatively new. Typically, it will involve an electroencephalogram, EEG for short, electroencephalogram, not an EKG. What's an EKG? Electrocardiogram, EKG, right? EKG records the brain activity. What does EKG record? The heart activity. So that would be for the first criterion. So this is not an EKG, this is an EEG. In other words, it's measuring brain waves. Remember when I show you epilepsis and all the brain waves, all right? Electrodes to the brain to measure brain activity. Is there brain activity or not? Okay, so partial brain death. What would be partial brain death? It has huge ethical implications.
The brain is dead, but the brain stem is still functioning.
Exactly. Only the cerebrum, only the cerebrum, only the white matter and the gray matter of the cerebrum, meaning that the person is not thinking, not feeling, not reacting, none of that. But if it's partial brain death, what is still alive? Brain stem, which controls what?
Breathing.
And for breathing to occur, one needs to occur also. Heartbeat, right? The lungs need to be alive. They need to have oxygen. They need, the tissue needs to be alive. That's kept alive by circulation. So brain stem, a person may be what we call brain dead, not. Okay, so partial brain death, I say thanks be to God, is not acceptable. And this was who of the three agencies, right? Of these 3 agencies, which one do you think was most involved in determining this, whether it should be partial brain death or total brain death? Which of the 3 agencies? Which are the 3 agencies? ABA, AMA, or the President's Commission? For determining whether it should be partial brain death or total brain death. In other words, whether the stem should be included or not.
AMA.
Yes, why? Are we talking about a legal process?
No.
We're talking about even an ethical process, before ethical process. We're talking about an organic process. If the stem is functioning, what is also functioning? The heart and the lungs. So I'm going to take out, let's say for organ transplant, let's say this patient is an organ donor. It's in their driver's license and everything else. Everybody in the family knows it. The person is comatose, the person is in vegetative state. Is the person going to be declared dead or not? The brain, the cerebrum has not functioned for years. All right. But the person is still breathing and the heart is still beating. What does that mean with regards to the stem? The stem is alive. The person is an organ donor. Are we going to take out that beating heart? No, that would kill the person. It's very tantalized that the person has been a vegetable for years, for decades. Here we have, and the person is only 50 years old or 40 years old. We have a very good heart to be transplanted into my friend who is waiting for the heart and who only has like a 3% functioning of the heart, 3% functioning. It's beautiful. You got to crawl on the floor to move. All right. So if the stem is alive, cannot pull out the vital organ because the person is still alive. So you see, it was crucial that the definition would be total brain death and not partial brain death. And of the three agencies, which was the one that was most involved in that decision between partial brain or total brain? And we're talking about an organic process. Yes, we're talking about an organic process. We're talking about a heartbeat. We're talking about the lungs functioning. So yes, we're talking about organic process. Who of these three commissions know more about the organic process of the human body? Yes, Medical Association. Why am I emphasizing on this? Why are you belaboring on this, Professor? Because think of the AMA. How many doctors belong to the AMA? All of the doctors of the United States? I say, I know a few doctors, very good doctors, who do not belong to the AMA because the AMA has become kind of liberal. You know, they were silent on abortion, for example. They did not have an opinion on abortion. That's horrible. That's sad. Because if anyone knows that that fetus is alive, is a medical doctor because they studied embryology in medical school. Okay. So some doctors who are very ethical people do not belong to the AMA. But it's safe to assume that there are millions of doctors in the US. Maybe not. Let's say there are hundreds of thousands of doctors in the US. Most of those doctors, do you think they belong to the AMA or not? Yeah. Yes, they do. The vast majority of medical doctors in the US belong to the AMA. Do you think they're all Catholic? Do you think they're all principled? You know, I mean, some doctors are doing the abortions, right? So they're certainly unethical according to our vision. And some doctors are prescribing lethal dosage for physician-assisted suicide. So not everyone has our ethics, right? And many, sadly, are actually utilitarian. So it was very important that this AMA, which is a very heterogeneous group of doctors, ethically speaking, agreed as a whole, you know, in their national convention to accept or to propose the definition of the neurological criteria for death to be total brain death, total brain death. I'm saying we're kind of locked out. I don't know if this definition were being proposed today, 40 years later in 2020s, if the AMA would still think that way. I don't know. But back in the 80s, at least, when it was brought up to a vote on the national conventions, the democratic process of voting and so forth, and participation, right? The vast majority, or at least a significant enough of a majority when they do their their procedures in the National Convention, they voted in favor of total brain death, total brain death. And that's a good thing because now that went through that, that hourglass, and now it's in the States. And that's it. And it would be a horrible mess to try to go back and now make it partial brain death. So thanks be to God, in the 80s, it passed. It's in the laws now, in every law book of the 50 states, and it is total brain death, okay? Total brain death. That's very important so that people who are in vegetative states, we don't start taking out their vital organs because they're not dead. They're not dead. Okay. All right. Forward. Let's look at a few more issues. Where are we? 11 o'clock. All right. We're actually kind of halfway, so this could be a good time to take a little break. Yeah, because let's do that. All right. 11, how about 10-minute break? We'll come back at 11:10. I'm going to start again at 11:10. All right. Sarah and Kendall, I don't know if you can hear me or not. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you very much. Let's take a break until 11:10, all right? Gotta pause recording. Okay. Let's get started again after the little breaks. So we have now a uniform determination of death that is applicable to all 50 states. And you see that it has two criteria, the standard criterion and the neurological criterion. Generally, the standard criterion does not require any instrumentation. All right, think of what I'm saying. Does not require any instrumentation, but it does require a clinician. In other words, it requires typically a medical doctor, or it could be a DO. What's a DO?
What was that?
A DO.
Oh, that on site, right?
It's a doctor in,
Oncology.
no, it's not oncology, it's osteopathic medicine, right? An osteopath. So it can be a DO, MD, DO, or it can be a nurse practitioner. I think those are the three titles that can do the declaration, the standard declaration of death. And they don't need any instruments to do it, though typically, what do you think that the doctor would use for the standard criteria? What kind of instrument or tool? The stethoscope, exactly. The stethoscope to hear the heartbeat amplified, just in case, right? Because we may not hear it just by the sound or the pulse, by the finger, but with the stethoscope is amplified. All right, the neurological criterion typically involves what kind of instrumentation? Exactly, an EEG, which is a pretty sophisticated equipment, right? It's a machine that has complex technology involved, has wires, electrodes that have to be put on the body of the person, along the head, different places, and to record, has to rerun for some time, I think 10 minutes or something like that. And many times a second attempt is done, maybe an hour later or 10 minutes later, whatever, I don't know the exact time, but a second, and sometimes a second EEG to see that it's still they're looking for flat, that it will include the brain stem. So the neurological criterion is a little more difficult to assess. In some states, one neurologist is sufficient. In other states, two neurologists have to certify. So that one can vary state by state. That's each state determines, okay? But at least the criterion exists, the neurological criterion exists, that it's available. Then each state needs to determine how that criterion is going to be determined. All right. The main implication for this is precisely vital organ transplantation, what is known as cadaveric organs. Cadaveric organs are coming from a person who has already died, which means that that person is no longer there. Now what we have is a cadaver. We have a corpse. All right. Putting it within the context of faith, life is fundamental, but life does not have absolute value. Now, this takes a little bit of thinking, reflecting. Life, I'm talking about human life. Human life has fundamental value, which means we need to protect it and cherish it and care for it and so forth. Our own and others, other people also. But human life is not an absolute value. So the distinction between these two, between fundamental and absolute, is fundamental. And it's subtle, but it's real. So another way of saying fundamental value is basic value. It has basic, it doesn't have superficial value, it has basic value. But it's not an absolute value. Again, when the concept is not too clear, flip it. Imagine if human life were an absolute value. What would we have to do? Could we make the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of life support? You see, if human life were an absolute value, we would always have to preserve it. Even if the person is dying, we would not be able to allow people to die. We would have to preserve life no matter what, even if the death process has begun, even if the person is cut into pieces, because it's absolute. And so the distinction is subtle, but it's real and very important, again, for bioethical issues. This distinction between fundamental and absolute allows us to let people die. Allows us to let people die, all right? Not kill them, but allow them to die. Again, think functionally. We're all around, let's say we're all members of the same family, and we're all gathered around grandma's bed because grandma is dying. Should we allow her to die or not? She has some time of terminal illness. There's no more medicine for her. There's no more cure for her. The cancer has invaded all the major organs. She's dying. Should we allow her to die or not? Yes, we have to allow her to die. We should. Well, then why don't we just give her an overdose of morphine then and get it over with? Yeah. No, because that would be killing her. But we may allow her to die. So what do we do with the morphine? We give her a dosage of morphine to control what? To control the pain. So we manage the pain. We want to kill the pain. We don't want to kill the patient. There are all these little sayings that help us. So we want to kill the pain, but we don't want to kill the patient. And so it's a dosage thing, and it will come down to titration. It will come down to the dosage that is given at each moment. And so really it's patient by patient, because different patients have different tolerance to pain. And it's also hour by hour. They have to be monitored. And so the death process is a loving process because it has to be followed by someone closely, a clinician, or at least a nurse who knows what's going on and knows exactly what amount of morphine to give. And there's going to be an increase in morphine little by little because the body also becomes tolerant to the morphine or to an analog. Some people are allergic to morphine, so they have to use an analog. An analog is a different chemical that does the same effect. Okay. See? And so really we do need to go patient by patient, and we have to be patient with the patient. This humanizes death. This humanizes death instead of just being left in a bed there and then go next morning and see if they're still dead or alive. Like sometimes it happens in nursing homes. Check them once a day or whatever. That's inhumane. All right. Now I put here life expectancy And why do I put USA life expectancy? Yeah, it depends if we are in a very poor country that has, most people don't have access to medical care, then those people are going to be dying from accidents or illness, appendicitis, or here, anyone dying from appendicitis is a horrible thing. I can tell you in a number of countries, of poor countries throughout the world, a lot of children die from appendicitis because they just didn't have medical care. The appendix exploded and then they got a sepsis or septicemia. They got poison of the blood. All right. So we have to go country by country. Who has access? And not everyone has access. We're really kind of spoiled over here. All right. What we call the Northwestern Hemisphere, mostly Europe and North America. Other countries of the world too, but it's a standard of care for that country. So the life expectancy is around 79 years of age. That's the average, but that's the average combined of men and women. But because we're not combined people, we're either men or women. For women, it's 81. For men, actually, I think it's about 78. Let me update that number. Men life expectancy 73. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's the world. How about USA? Look, USA. 78 or 77. Rolling up little by little, because why is this coming up from the 60s? Well, yeah, just from the 60s to the 20s. 1960, from 70 to 77. Why?
I think going up.
Yeah, life expectancy.
General prosperity in medicine.
Yeah, access to medicine, right? The general population has more access to medicine. From the 60s, I mean, I was around in the 60s, that's not that long ago. I know it's last century, it's last millennium, but it's not that long. And it's gone up by 7 years, that's 10%. From 70 to 77 years of age, life expectancy in the United States has increased by 10% in 60 years. Pretty good, huh? Okay. Anyway, this is kind of a guidepost, and I use it also because this seems to be around the age of the human body, the average life expectancy of the human body just naturally. In other words, after 80 years of age, let's round it up to about 80, major organs start failing irreversibly. And there's what we call systemic shutdown. All right, major organs start degenerating irreversibly. The liver, the lungs, the brain, the heart, kidneys, everything starts shutting down little by little, generally, okay, around 80 years of age. So we can say for the human species, and of course, each species has its own life expectancy, right? Depending on the species. So for the human, it's around 80 years of age, approximately, right? A little younger for men than for women. I don't know exactly why, probably because of the heart attack thing, which is a major cause of death we saw in general, but mostly affects more men than women. In fact, the big window for heart attack, what's the big window for heart attack in men? 40s and 50s. I was thinking about that. Why not 70 or 80? Why not later? Or when if our life expectancy is about 77, right? So this should be 77, updated. Yes, peak career stress, peak professional stress, peak career stress, peak family stress. You know, the kids are teenagers, whatever. So 40s and 50s is the window, is the highest, is the peak for heart attack in men in the United States. All right, let's go forward a little bit more. These are these are various issues. They seem to be unrelated or they seem to be disparate, but they're coming together little by little, just kind of getting everyone on the same page with regards to background and terminology. Also because each cohort in this program is different, and I've had medical doctors, I've had nurses, I've had teachers, I've had graduate students, I've had housewives, priests, deacons, and so it's very varied, and that's why this terminology kind of brings all the various backgrounds to a uniform language that we can use, all right? So management of pain and suffering are somewhat different because pain and suffering are somewhat different, right? Sometimes they come together, pain and suffering come together, but pain is more what and suffering is more what? Pain is more what? Suffering is more what?
Ordinary.
No, pain is more physical, suffering is more psychological, right? I've given the example. What's a funny example of pain and suffering being different? The young married couple having the first child, who's in pain and who's suffering?
I would say mother.
Who's in labor? The mom is in labor, and so she's in pain. You know, say the pains of labor, right? Okay, why is she not suffering?
What was that?
Why is she not suffering necessarily? Even though she's in excruciating pain and screaming her head off. Because it's their first child, they've been looking for this child for a long time. They want to have, there's their first kid. So hopefully they're happy about it and it's not a curse, it's a blessing, right? And so she's all excited about the first kid, at least the first one. Anyway, we can assume safely that when they're having their children, they're not necessarily suffering, or she's not suffering. How about him? He's either watching through the glass, or today he's standing right next to her on the bed.
He's suffering.
He's suffering. Why?
I guess watching his wife. go
Yeah.
through pain.
Because his wife is in pain, right? But and he cannot have the labor of pains, the pains of labor. So it's just a funny contrast, but it just points out graphically that pain and suffering not necessarily come together. All right. And there's a professional for each one of them. So what's the professional for pain in general?
That's
How-
very-
How about the medical doctor? Not the veterinarian. Unless we're talking about the pet. The medical doctor. How about suffering? Yeah, the shrink, the counselor, the psychologist, the psychiatrist, the priest, right? So you see, there's a professional for each one of these, and they don't necessarily have their distinct professions. But it does take the team. It takes a team to put together. So many hospitals have a pastoral care team embedded part of the healing process. And in fact, there's even articles documented that people of faith heal better, faster in general than people without faith, because without faith, they tend to despair, they're angry, they're upset, and that can also alter their immune system. But people who have faith and put the suffering in context of offering it up and the teachings of their faith, then it gives them hope, and it makes them better patients for healing better, faster in general. All right. So the management of pain and or suffering, we're seeking relief. All right. And then it depends on what is available from the standard of care. It's called standard of care, the analgesics that are available, the protocols, the therapies that are going to be used, et cetera, et cetera. They can be physical therapies, they can be psychological therapies, or even spiritual therapies. All right. How about when we analyze it? Now, this is the bioethical analysis. The bioethical analysis, we're looking for benefit burden, all right? Overall, not just physical, even psychological, but overall benefit for the patient, or if the benefits outweigh the burdens or not, right? Put it on a scale, if the benefits outweigh the burdens or not. And you'll see, now we're going to look at two directives from the ERTs that speak specifically about this. And that will set clearly for us, hopefully, the distinction between ordinary or extraordinary means, between assisting or substituting vital organs, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the bioethical analysis here, this benefit burden analysis, okay? Also, just to be clear, we need a diagnosis in order to have a prognosis. What's the prognosis? Doctor, what's the prognosis for my loved one?
Would that be the plan of? I guess,
The plan and execution. In other words, the hope of recovery. If the doctor says abysmal, well, you better start making arrangements with the funeral homes. Okay, abysmal is a word that may be used, or not good, or very iffy, right? On the other extreme, the prognosis looks very good, extremely well, it's encouraging, etc. It means that the hope of recovery is a good hope of recovery. Based on what?
the diagnosis.
Based on past cases, right? Now, what cases? So you see, this is all evidence-based. It's evidence-based. How is the doctor going to tell me if my friend who has breast cancer is going to recover or not? Or how well she's going to recover? Well, based on past cases. In other words, most women who have had breast cancer with your conditions, it's going to be with your age, with your lifestyle, with the size of the tumors, how many tumors you have, where they are, and the standard of care is going to be what? Well, it's going to be the removal of the breast, the mastectomy, double mastectomy, and then follow up with what? Chemotherapy and radiotherapy and all that, right? And maybe even also psychological therapy. And the recovery is long-term recovery. So that's all in the future. That's based on previous cases. So doctor is not going to say, oh, yes, you're going to heal, or you're going to heal by this day or by this month or so forth. No, based on other women with your profile, with your age and lifestyle and so on and so forth, and the size of the tumors and everything else, we have seen this, that the majority recover by this time, the majority, et cetera, et cetera. So it's based on previous cases. So it's all evidence-based. And that requires what? The prognosis requires what? Clinically, from the doctors. A diagnosis. What is it that she has? Does she have cancer, or does she have appendicitis, or does she have pneumonia? Or is the heart at 5%? So the diagnosis, see, this is where the clinician comes in, because the clinician has tools that the clinician has studied in medical school to come up with the diagnosis. So we say no diagnosis, not prognosis. Okay. And I can tell you, some people go to the doctor, they feel pain, they go to the doctor, they go to the hospital, they go to the emergency room, and they walk out of there and there's no diagnosis because they couldn't find anything wrong clinically. That's very frustrating, right? The pain may have gone away or maybe not, but they can't find anything. So they had to do further studies. Now it's getting more complicated. Okay. We cannot get away from the clinical thing, but we have to go beyond the clinical thing. Once we have a diagnosis and a prognosis, then the ethical issues start kicking in. What are the benefits and burden? What if I do have cancer and I say, okay, I don't feel any pain. I don't feel any restrictions or handicaps or disabilities right now. I feel full of energy and I'm thinking clearly and so forth. So I'm going to say, okay, I have cancer, but I'm going to I'm not going to go to treatment. Treatment is drastic. Chemotherapy, radiotherapy, you lose your hair, you lose your appetite, you feel like vomiting all the time. It's debilitating, you feel depressed. So why should I go through that if I don't feel anything? Well, because the cancer is going to advance. I have that option. Is that an ethical option? I have the ethical option to say, I'll die with the cancer when it kicks in and it kills me, it kills me. So there is that option. You know, there's no ethical obligation to treat every cancer. Now, if it's a little skin cancer mole thing, that's one thing, but if it's metastasized, that's a different story. So what's the advancement? What's the stage? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? See, the clinicians, we cannot get away from them, but we have to go beyond them in the bioethical analysis. The clinician will say, it's out of your mind if you don't go into dialysis. It's out of your mind if you don't go through chemotherapy. Well, with all due respect, doctor, that's your opinion, but I have a different opinion. I'm going to travel the world for a few months and then I'm going to die. You know, we have to respect patients' opinion. Now, we hope that the patient's opinions are reasonable. Reasonable. That's going to kick in, right? So when we're doing the analysis, bioethically, we look at ordinary or extraordinary. And we already said which one obligates generally. Which one obligates ethically? Ordinary means of life support or extraordinary means? By the very word, which one obligates? Ordinary. We have an obligation, we have a moral, ethical obligation to maintain people of life support when the means of life support is ordinary means. Also, proportionate is the same, it's a synonym, because sometimes you run into the word proportionate, ordinary or proportionate. In contrast, extraordinary or disproportionate. Okay. Now, this is the rub. Clinically, clinicians generally don't use these terms, ordinary and extraordinary, proportionate and disproportionate are bioethical terms. They're philosophical terms and theological terms, you know, but clinicians don't use those terms. Clinicians tend to talk about standard medical practice or standard of care. Dialysis is a standard of care for what? That's a real question, guys. Dialysis is a standard of care for what? For what diagnosis?
The liver, or
Wrong organ. Dialysis. That's what. Come on, we spend time on this. Show you pictures. Dialysis.
Blood,
Yeah.
it's cleansing.
Or what? The kidneys, kidney failure. The kidneys, right? So dialysis is a standard of care for kidney failure. What's the diagnosis? Kidney failure, renal failure. So you'll see on the diagnosis, renal failure, right? We have to understand what renal is. Renal is the kidneys, failure. They're shutting down. It may not be total, maybe partial renal failure. Okay. And dialysis is the standard of care. However, and when it's not standard of care, in other words, when there is no care for this particular treatment, then they go into experimental treatment. I was talking to another friend of mine. We were in the seminary together many, many decades ago in the 1980s. Then he fell in love. So he left the seminary, married this lady. And eventually that lady died. And now he has another friend. But now this other friend has cancer. And the doctors already told her, we're at the limit of the standard of care. There's nothing more standard treatment that we can be doing. That we've done the chemotherapy, we've done the radiotherapy, the tumors are still there. Sometimes they're called lesions. The lesions are still there. So now the doctor proposed, if you want, you can go into trials, into clinical trials. What is a clinical trial? It's an experiment. She has to sign off whether she wants to go there or not obligated. But that's the terminology, clinical trials or experimental treatment. Who is sponsoring? And by the way, she doesn't have to pay anything for these clinical trials, even though it's going to cost thousands and maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to do the clinical trial. Who's paying? The insurance companies. The insurance companies are paying, the health insurance companies are paying for the clinical trials. Why? Because that data is informative for the insurance company. You see, that way they can tweak their policies one way or another to make it less, to lower the blow of claims for treatments. In other words, if by this experimental treatments, in this clinical trials, let's say that her tumors begin shrinking with the clinical trials, with a new drug that is being experimented, right? They need the clinical trials. They need that stage 3, the phase 3, which is try the drug on humans to see if it works or not. And the tumor starts shrinking. Well, that's very good for the drug, right? That's very good for that drug company who is manufacturing that drug and wants to get clearance from FDA, Food and Drug Administration, to put it on the market and make a few $1 million on the drug, because now this new drug works. And that experimental treatment, if it works, it will become the new standard of practice, the new standard of care. And so the pharmaceutical companies are paying, the insurance companies are paying, because if there's hope of healing, then all those people benefit. And of course, medicine benefits. The medical doctor is a professional. They need to get paid for the treatment, and the nurse and the technician and everybody who's running the blood test on a regular basis, sending it to the lab, that all costs money. We're in a market economy. Okay. It's just that the language doesn't always match. Sometimes what is considered standard medical practice or standard of care may be for the patient, for this patient here and now, extraordinary. And that's where the bioethical rub comes in. So how do we determine that? Okay, these are the two directives that regulate, at least for Catholic and for principled ethics. I mean, the number of non-Catholics, many non-Catholic people also follow these directives because they're reasonable. They make a lot of sense. Okay. One does not have to be Catholic to follow the ERDs. What are the ERDs? These are the ERDs. They're called ethical and religious directives. Here's the word. Ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services. Latest edition from 2018, the 6th edition. I was involved in the work of this edition way back in 2018. It had been approved by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. That's throughout the whole United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. It has also gone to the Vatican for approval and came back and they said, yes, clutch it, it's good, all right? So it's about 70 directives, and this is the little document. Just punch in ethical and religious directives, and it comes up already, the first 3 words, ethical and religious directives, there it is. The title is almost longer than the document. It's actually a pamphlet. I usually carry one in my pocket. Here it is. All right, so it's made in this form so that the professionals can carry it in their pocket. And it's about 40 pages, about 40 half pages. So it's actually 20 pages. And here you can take a look once you're here. Yeah, you can download it for free from the internet. There it is, in English or in Spanish. It also comes in Spanish. And that's the document. All right. So this is basically, we say this is the bioethical Bible for Catholic healthcare. Bioethical Bible here, it's got 6 parts, part 1 through 6, all right, 6 parts. Each part is like a chapter, like a mini chapter, but each part is like 2 or 3 pages long. And each part, so the first part is a social responsibility of Catholic healthcare. Catholic healthcare comprises about 25% of healthcare in the United States is Catholic. We talk about hospitals, nursing homes, rehabilitation centers, hospice at home, et cetera, about 25% of healthcare in the United States is provided by some kind of Catholic agency. All right, so it's very significant. That's the social responsibility. Then there's part 2 is the pastoral and spiritual responsibility. This has to do mostly with the sacraments and access to spirituality for patients. If a patient is Catholic and wants to receive Holy Communion, they cannot get up out of bed and go to the church. So the church comes through them, through Eucharistic ministers, et cetera, all right? If a patient is non-Catholic and wants to be baptized before they die, they can also request that, et cetera. So this is part 2. Part 3, professional-patient relationship. In other words, doctor-patient relationship, the relationship of trust and confidentiality and all those things that apply to doctor-patient relationship. Part 4 is on issues at the beginning of human life. For example, in vitro fertilization is a big no, abortions no, contraception no, natural family yes, everything that we talked about in the last course. Part 5 is the one that applies now. So download it, read it, take a look. It's only about 3 or 4 pages, okay, half pages. So these are issues at seriously ill and die. So part 5 is end of life. It's the one that applies to this course. And finally, part 6 is on collaboration. Collaboration, for example, between Catholic and non-Catholic hospitals. This is in view of mergers and all this stuff that's going on now. Systems, when systems, say Catholic hospital merges with a non-Catholic hospital, what may be allowed, what may not be allowed. I think I narrated to you, I've been in Miami for 52 years. I've been a priest here for 37 years. And they used to be, in Miami, there used to be 2 standalone hospitals. One was Baptist Hospital, Kendall Drive and 87th Avenue in the Southwest, big standalone Baptist. And then on the Catholic side was Mercy Hospital, near the entrance to Key Biscayne, there near Villa Vizcaya, near Coconut Grove area. So these standalones back in the 70s, back in the 80s, and then the mergers began and the systems began to grow. And so there was talk at one point of merging Mercy and Baptist into a single system, right? And that merger fell through, mostly because Baptist to this day has an in vitro clinic that is very profitable, and they didn't want to let it go. And that was a no-no for us. Eventually, Mercy got bought out also, so Baptist eventually grew and bought other hospitals, Doctors Hospitals, South Miami Hospital, Mariners in the Keys, etc. So now it's a whole system of hospitals, about 6 or 8 of them. And Mercy got bought out by HCA, which is Hospital Corporation of America. They own about 180 hospitals. It's the largest system of hospitals in the United States, HCA, Hospital Corporation of America. They bought Mercy, and it's secular, it's non-denominational, it's just private for profit system. But they decided to keep the Catholic identity of Mercy Hospital for 5 years in the contract, in the covenant, to see what happens. And if they didn't lose patients, and clientele, then they would maintain the Catholic identity. And so the 5 years have passed. It's been about 10 years now. And they thought that it was still profitable. So they still maintain the Catholic identity of Mercy Hospital. And even though they're no longer obligated by the covenant, by the original contract of the 5 years. So that's sweet. And it means that we still have a Catholic hospital in Miami, even though it's not owned by the Archdiocese of Miami. Okay, because HCA decided to keep it that way. They didn't lose. In other words, people traditionally, that's been the Catholic hospital forever in Miami since the 50s, I think it was, or maybe the 60s. It was started by a group of religious nuns called Sisters of St. Joseph. And the nuns are no longer there, but some other nuns are there now to run the pastoral care service associated with other priests, etc. But they're keeping the Catholic identity. So that's an example, thank you, of how this collaboration, part 6, can kick in and help. What are the limits of collaboration? You know, maybe today, if that same merger was considered, could have been worked out between Mercy and Baptist, if somehow that of what we call the offensive procedures, also sterilizations that are non-therapeutic, contraceptive sterilizations are also a no-no. If they can be carved out of the contract, perhaps the merger could go through, but it's difficult. Okay. All right, let's go a little further here and let's look at part 5 so you see what it looks like. All right, so every part has 2 parts to it, 2 sections. One section, the first section is an introduction, which just states general principles. You know, it has several paragraphs, as you can see here. Okay, and it's usually a page or less. You can see here of the introduction. And then it goes into directives, specific directives, okay? And here we are at 55 already, which means that before part 5, there were 54 other directives, and each directive is typically 1 paragraph, as you can see there. And it's a statement, it's a paragraph that is very focused, very direct on one particular issue or obligation. And look at this, 56 and 57 are the 2 directives that we're looking at right now with regards to ordinary versus extraordinary means of life support. All right, so there it is, tiny. I have transplanted them over here a little bigger so we can read them. So this is the nomenclature ERD 56. What does ERD stand for? Ethical and Religious Directive for Catholic Healthcare Services, 6th edition, which is the latest one. In other words, this document, ERD is this document, the current edition, right? All right, and 56 is the specific directive, the specific paragraph that talks about ordinary means of life support or proportionate means. So here it is. Person has a moral or ethical obligation to use ordinary or proportionate, synonyms, means of preventing his or her, or preserving his or her life. And then the second sentence goes on to explain what are ordinary or what are proportionate means. Proportionate means are those that, in the judgment of the patient, offer reasonable benefit and do not entail excessive burden. Okay, so benefit burden analysis, you see it here. More benefits than burden, or impose excessive expense on the family or the community at large. So you can see, really, it's a pretty liberal definition. It's a pretty open definition. What's the key? Who decides if it's proportionate or disproportionate? Who decides? The patient decides. The doctor suggests. The rest of the family members suggest. Right? You're crazy if you don't go through that treatment. Or you're crazy if you go through that treatment. Well, those are opinions. But the patient decides. How should the patient decide? Reasonably. All right. Case in point, who can give me an unreasonable? I mean, I say this with all due respect. But which is an unreasonable refusal of standard of care? Let's say a person is in an accident, has lost a lot of blood. They're wheeled into Jackson Emergency, the trauma center by helicopter. They lost a lot of blood, but they're still alive. What do they need? Immediately.
A blood transfusion.
Transfusion, right? Who are those who reject transfusion? Jehovah's Witness. In their belief, they believe that the human soul literally resides within the blood. So if I take blood from someone else, I'm receiving the soul of that person, the spirit in me, which is abhorrent, is offensive, and they are not allowed to do that religiously. They're not allowed to receive another person's soul in them. All right. In fact, I don't know if they even go this far as the transfusion has actually killed the person. Has not killed the person because the person is still alive, the donor, the blood donor. But part of their soul somehow is now in the bag of blood, right? So to them, in their belief, that's abhorrent. That's an abomination. They can never do that. What happens? That person who's bleeding to death, should they be strapped down and forced to take the? No. They have a right to refusal, but is it reasonable?
Yeah.
With all due respect, it's not reasonable.
Right.
It's a faith belief, but it's not reasonable. Because what does that take? Really, it just takes a puncture of a needle to establish a line and to give the transfusion. And with all due respect, the soul does not reside in the blood, because if the donor is alive, the soul is indivisible. So a part of the soul cannot be in the blood, let alone the whole soul, because then that would kill, a donation of blood would kill the patient, it will kill the donor. So with all due respect, that refusal of a transfusion is unreasonable. Objectively speaking, we have to respect a person's conscience, and mostly for legal purposes, why are Jehovah's Witnesses not transfused? Forcibly. Why are they not transfused forcibly? Because then everybody's liable for doing that. You can have forced blood into another person if it's against their belief or if they don't want it. So you see how legalism takes him here, but and we're not going to strap him down for sure, but we should try to convince the Jehovah's Witness, please reconsider, because this aspect of your religion is really unreasonable. This aspect is unreasonable. The rest of your religion may be fine, but this aspect is going to kill you. You're going to lose your life. So you see, I think that lately I should bring myself up to date because I use that as an example, but I've heard that Jehovah's Witnesses have somehow worked it out now that they can receive a transfusion. I don't know, maybe they've reevaluated their position and it's fine. Because, hey, welcome to the truth, right? There's nothing wrong about accepting the fuller truth and the fuller meaning of truth in life. And we come to the realization that there's a fuller, deeper meaning of truth in life, and we may accept that. That's positive, that's good. So anyway, a couple of things about this. It's the patient who decides. That decision should be a reasonable decision. Sometimes patients are reasonable. They're acting out of fear, they're acting out of hate, they're acting out of who knows what, superstition, magic. No, I'm going to do the voodoo thing instead. I'm going to go to a voodoo doctor with the dolls. But that's unreasonable. We should try to reason with the patient, and that's why you're taking this course, so you can reason with your family members when these issues come up sooner or later. Okay. And then 57 is the flip. A person may forego extraordinary or disproportionate means of life support. In other words, they may refuse disproportionate or extraordinary means of preserving life. And which are disproportionate means? Those that in the patient's judgment do not offer reasonable hope of benefit or entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on family and community. This is very gray, right? What does excessive mean? $20, $2 million? We don't know. Some families can afford it, some families cannot afford the treatment. If the person is in a vegetative state, somebody's paying, right, for maintaining that person alive. And so you can see that this is it's pretty open, it's trying to put some reasonable limits into making the decision. But the key is between ordinary or extraordinary. That's the black and white. Now, what constitutes ordinary, what constitutes extraordinary? We have to dialogue with the clinicians. Okay? But at the end of the day, it's the patient who decides. Of course, if the patient is the minor, who decides? If the patient is a minor, who decides? The parents or the proxy? Whoever has been assigned. If the parents are not around or if the parents are incompetent, then the state will assign an ad litem. Ad litem, the one who decides for the minor. It's a legal thing, right? We don't all of a sudden become responsible on the first day of our 18th birthday. I know some 16-year-olds who may be a little more judgmental than their parents because they don't ride a motorcycle, but their parent rides a motorcycle. So you see how law also comes into play here, right? So we have to look at the medical aspect of it. We have to look at the clinical aspect. We have to look at the legal aspect. And we have to look at the human, social, family aspect of it, right? But ultimately, it's the patient who decides. And we have to respect that. Again, trying to reason with the patient of what is reasonable. All right, now I tried years ago, and did I send you that article, the distinction between assisting and substituting? Did I send you an article from the NCBC? I don't know, did I? National Catholic Bioscience Center, I haven't sent you that, okay. I'm gonna send you that article. I wrote a little article on the distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs that kind of blends in the clinical part, a little bit of the legal, but mostly the ethical part, right? And so to try to use this as a standard of the difference between, first of all, we're talking about vital organs, right? Because we're talking about the dying process. And then is the standard of care, what the doctors are proposing. Do they assist or they substitute the organs? The vital organ that is failing. And so to answer this question, when to withhold or when to withdraw? What's the difference between withholding and withdrawing?
Withholding is keeping someone on.
Exactly. To begin with, in other words, never hooking them up. It probably just takes one H, right? Thank you. Okay, so never to put the patient on dialysis. Or never to put in a peg, it's a tube to the stomach, a feeding tube to the stomach to begin with. That's withholding. How about withdrawing?
Removing.
Exactly. Once the patient is on dialysis, when to stop dialysis, if and when to stop, if and when to pull out the peg, right? If and when to disconnect the vent or to pull out the vent to extubate. That's withdrawing. So when to withhold or when to withdraw. And I can tell you different traditions, different religion traditions see this differently. I have heard anecdotally that, for example, for the Jewish people in general, for Jewish religion, this is very crucial because once they connect the patient, they may not disconnect the patient until the patient actually dies. Okay? So for them, what do they end up doing if this were the scenario? Question. For the Jewish people, if this is true, what I've heard anecdotally, that once they connect the patient to life support system, they cannot disconnect that patient until the patient actually dies on their own by some organ failure. Think again of a person in vegetative state with a vent and a peg. Once they connect, they cannot disconnect according to their belief. So what do you think is going to happen knowing that beforehand? They will likely not connect to begin with. They will withhold. They will tend to withhold more. In other words, they will tend not to do the trach and not to put in the peg, because once it's in, they have to leave it. So knowing that with the foreknowledge that they may get stuck with a loved one in vegetative state for decades in bed, then they tend not to connect to begin with. All right. And so, is that ethical or not? It depends. We have to go patient by patient. How critical is the organ dying? First of all, is it a vital organ that's dying, one or more? And is the procedure assisting or substituting? And then even within substituting, if, let's say it's substituting, but it may be substituting temporarily, like a vent. And I'm going to get to that one in a minute. All right, I already talked about dialysis. So is dialysis ordinary or extraordinary means of life support? Well, hold on, don't answer them. First, clinically, is dialysis experimental treatment? Is dialysis experimental treatment?
No.
No, it is what? If it's not experimental treatment, then it is clinically standard medical practice or the standard of care, right? And for what condition? For what diagnosis? Liver failure, kidney failure, renal failure, all right? It's a standard of care for renal failure, clinically. To the point that if a medical doctor who has a patient on renal failure and that medical doctor does not recommend dialysis, that medical doctor is suable, liable for malpractice. Okay? That's how standard it is. That's how common. All right. Bioethically, is dialysis ordinary or extraordinary?
No.
Well, does it assist or substitute the vital organ? It substitutes specifically, physically, materially, right here. What is this? That's the filter. This is the equivalent, this big, huge tube cylinder is equivalent to the two little kidneys that we have. They're smaller than our fists, maybe half the size of our fist. This whole thing, in addition to this other big refrigerator machine, is a substitute for the two little kidneys that we have on our backs, below the rib cage. Okay? So it's substituting the kidneys. It's not assisting the kidneys. Right? Therefore, and what is, again, not only think functionally, but evidence-based. How can I say with certainty that dialysis is substituting the kidneys?
How could you say?
How can I say for certain? I'm not a medical doctor, you're not medical doctors, but how can we say bioethically that dialysis is substituting the kidneys?
Because without it, the patient dies.
Exactly. The patient would be on total renal failure, absolute total renal failure. The kidneys don't work. So that patient's going to last maybe a few hours and then become totally intoxicated and die from their own poison. So if the kidneys are total shutdown, 100%, and you put them on dialysis, and the patient continues to live for years, it's certainly substituting. See, we just think it out, reason it out, work it out, think it through. All right. Like Matt Damon said in The Martian, one of my favorite movies, just science the hell out of it. He said it in more graphic terms. He said, have you seen the movie, The Martian? Oh, come on. It's one of the greatest movies ever. Go see it. It's fantastic. You can now watch it online. Fantastic. Yeah. He gets left behind in Mars. And the rest of the movie is trying to rescue him. One day he says, I'm not going to die. I'm going to science the bleep out of it. Okay. Fantastic movie. Futuristic, but very realistic. It happened just in a few years. Moving on, we talk about respirator, ventilator. You see, the vent is tricky because the vent could either assist or substitute, depending on what? The vent. What is the vent? Is this tube, this plastic tube that is going into this patient all the way to his lungs, trachea, right? All right. So what is the machine doing?
It's compressing.
Pumping oxygen in and out of the lungs. In fact, there's a bellows, there's a big cylinder like a piston down here. And for some of the machines, you can actually hear it very subtly. Okay. So is the machine, at least at first, assisting or substituting the lungs? Substituting 100%. They start at 100% vent, right? And then what does this technician do? What is the technician looking at on the screen?
Yes, the lungs. Yes.
The lungs on the screen? Is there a picture of the lungs on the screen?
Oxygen.
No, here's the graph. Okay. Let's see. Let's see if it has ventilator screen. Yeah. There it is. This is what the tech is looking at. A little bit better one. Okay. Here are the actual numbers. It doesn't have the number that I'm looking for. Got all the numbers except the one I'm looking for. I'm looking for perfusion, which is the oxygenation of the blood.
Right.
What's ideal? Oh, here's one.
It's like 97.
Yes. Here's an EKG, by the way. It's a heartbeat. Here's the breathing, which is about 20 breaths per minute. Oh. Okay, here's oxygen percentage. Yeah, but that's not the real one. Anyway, yeah, that perfusion, the tech is looking at all this, all right? And the tech knows how to interpret all this in every, oh, here's perfusion. Finally. Oops, I always make this mistake. And now it's a hassle to go there. Here. All right, you see this 100? You see O2 percentage? Actually makes it smaller. No. Okay, you can barely see it. It says O2 percentage, 100. So this guy is perfusing royally. All right. Oh, here it is down here also. So the clinician is looking at this. And what's your feel? Does this look good or bad?
Good.
Looks pretty good, right? It's pretty regular on the beats, pretty regular on the amplitude. So frequency and amplitude of the waves looks pretty good. Okay, and so the tech comes over and says, "Oh, Joe is doing pretty good. Look at this. Joe's doing pretty good." So the knob is going to go where?
Yeah, turn the oxygen down.
Down. Turn the machine down, because nature is economic. Therefore, not only is the mind, but also the body lazy. If the lungs, if my lungs are getting 100% oxygen from the machine, why should I do the effort? Why should I move the intracostals, right? Why should I move my muscles, the chest, muscles of the ribs, and the diaphragm? That's using up ATPs, that's using up calories. I want to preserve my energy. So let the machine continue. The bad news is that the lungs can get lazy and don't want to breathe anymore. So that's not positive, that's not conducive. We need to encourage the lungs to breathe. And so that's the weaning process. The weaning process is when this fellow turns this knob down to 90% oxygen and to 85%, and then he'll come back 1 or 2 hours later, whatever the protocol is, and this is all documented based on previous trials, previous data. So the accumulation of data, everyone who's on event right now in the US is feeding into registries, and this is what is taught in medical schools, right? Or even this is a technician. This guy doesn't even have to be a doctor. This is a technician who knows how to read this and keeps weaning down that machine to where it goes to maybe, I don't know, I'm saying out loud, maybe between 40 and 60% of the machine. So what does that mean functionally? If the vent is between 40 and 60%, what does that mean functionally for the lungs? That the lungs are doing the rest, right? Which is what? 60 to 40%. So what's that? About half and half, right? So what's indicated? Extubation. Don't swallow, don't swallow, don't swallow, don't swallow. Take the tube out. Patient breathe or not breathe. All right, so the moment of truth. But anyway, what I'm saying is that this weaning process is to get the lungs to react, to come back. But wait a minute, the patient has pneumonia, which means that the lungs are filling with fluid, which is a reaction of the body to the infection, to the pneumococcus bacterium, right? Putting out fluid with antibodies and all that, the body trying to heal itself, but it's filling the lungs with fluid. That's not a good thing because the lungs are not used to breathing in total fluid. They need to be moist and wet around the alveoli, but not total fluid, because that's called drowning. And so what's indicated for the patient to heal from the pneumonia? Hello? Antibiotics. Antibiotics take time to kick in. The normal course is about what? Normally, give or take a few days. Take these antibiotics for a week, approximately. You know, again, the protocol. So the patient needs about a week to heal from the pneumonia with the antibiotics and the fluid of the lungs to go down. So you see, with pneumonia, it's a specific case where you have temporarily a substitution of the lungs, temporarily. But what's the prognosis? The prognosis within a week is that the patient will be able to breathe on her own. And at that point, the vent becomes assisting the lungs. So this is a case where the vent may start as substituting, but with a positive prognosis, may eventually step back to assisting. And then the extubation. All right? That's if everything goes well with the course of pneumonia healing. Okay? Again, CPR may assist or substitute. This one is a little more tricky in the sense that what is involved in calling the shots, whether we should resuscitate or not. Let's say we're paramedics. Well, if we're paramedics, we're kind of obligated to resuscitate, right? Unless there's a DNR order. But they say we're not paramedics, but we know how to do CPR. Okay, so what's going to determine the difference between, do I assist this person? Do I resuscitate this person or not? Turn a corner on the sidewalk and I see a person on the floor. Put my ear up to the chest. I don't hear a heartbeat. Oh, maybe it's heart attack. Should I resuscitate or not? I know how to do it. Am I looking at what looks to be a healthy 20-year-old, or am I looking at an old 85-year-old? I'm pushing the limits. It doesn't? I would be hesitant if it's an old person.
Yeah.
Because brittle bones, calcium loss, brittle bones, broken ribs, punctured lungs, and now I got a person on the floor who has punctured ribs, punctured lungs. Punctured lungs means that they're getting blood from there into the lungs, into the puncture wound, and it's all of a sudden became even more critical, double critical.
Dr. Trophy,
Yes,
can you hear me?
yes, go ahead, please, Sarah.
Hi, I have to leave a little bit early. Is it okay if I watch the rest on the recording?
Yeah, go ahead. You're going to your CPR class?
I actually already have my CPR,
You
by
have
the
it
way.
already, okay. You haven't said a word in all this. You're reserving your comments. Would you resuscitate an 80-year-old?
Yeah, I would if it, I mean, when I actually start like the EMT clinicals, if we come across again something like that, like someone going through cardiac arrest and having a heart attack, then it's like my obligation to assist.
No matter the condition of the patient?
Yeah, no matter the condition, because they tell us that if there's a pulse, even if there's something, you have to work them.
Okay. Do they talk about, I know you have to leave, but should have asked this a long time ago. So in the training, do they talk about punctured lungs?
Yeah, they do. That's what they say, like that, to not press on that, was it the xiphoid process? Because again, it can break and puncture a lung.
Okay, so it's about technique. It's doing it further up or whatever.
Yeah, just doing it like on the right spot on the chest, and then making sure to not go too not go too deep.
Okay, so it may or may not do it, right? May or may not work.
Yeah, they tell me that it can happen, and then there's times where it won't happen. It all like depends.
Okay. All right. So basically, you do resuscitate, may have to refine your technique a little bit depending on the age of the patient or the condition.
If they're an adult, it doesn't matter. There's like, it's the same depth when you go down like on an adult, and so it doesn't matter if they're like 80 or like 50, you still go the same depth.
Okay. All right. So that clarifies a lot. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, great. So go ahead. That clarifies, at least for me, basically always resuscitate. How about a DNR order? You have to be.
For a DNR, they told us, so you have to make sure there is a DNR. Usually like they have like tags and stuff and you have to call, but even while like if someone say it has like a DNR, like sometimes I have it like tattooed, like you have to double check, you have to call. I forget what it is, but there's like an agency that you call. And so until you get that like positive, okay, this is a DNR, you still have to resuscitate them.
Right. So word of mouth doesn't count. You actually have to see the document or some kind of solid proof of the document.
Yeah, they need like just they need some type of proof, because what if what if that person doesn't like have a DNR?
Yeah, or they changed it.
Yeah, or they changed it,
DNI
exactly.
years ago, and then they rescinded it, but it didn't go through the system, yes. Okay, gets a little tricky. Okay, Sarah, thanks a lot. Almost done. All right, so defibrillator is more assisting because it's restoring the pulse. All right, it's restoring the cardiac rhythm of arrhythmia, but it's not as life-threatening. At least that's my non-clinical opinion. So finally, we just come to the big question of killing or allowing to die. And this is squarely a bioethical question. All right. We may never kill a person, an innocent person, because we do have a right to self-defense, right? But we may never kill an innocent person ethically, but we may allow to die. In fact, we should allow to die. Because not allowing someone to die if they're dying is cruel and it's unreasonable. Because sooner or later, we're all going to die. Okay, 12:30, even though we started late, finished at 12:30. So, questions, comments? All right, we'll continue going forward with these issues. Yep. That's your summary? Very good. Okay. All right, so thank you once again, and we're gonna wrap it up, and we're gonna meet again next Saturday. Continue eventually. One of the biggest issues we're gonna look at is nutrition and hydration, precisely on a patient who is in a vegetative state. Okay, that's kind of the combination of this one. So, being July 1st, hope you have a good rest of the weekend and the long weekend, and safe, especially safe, please.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll try.
Yeah, you know what happened today in Canada? Well, nothing, or tonight, because what is today in Canada? Anybody know? Today is called Canada Day, because Canada has a day off for every day of the month. Let me stop this so that I can download and record.
I have a day off.